Start off by giving Dr. Murphy the prizes that he is earning, I guess, I don't know, prizes. This is, of course, an annual lecture, and so to commemorate that, we have a plaque in our office. If you haven't seen it already, you can come by and look. It lists all of those who have delivered the Kurt Ritter Lecture since its creation in 2009. So if you want to take a tour of our offices, it is there. And of course, Dr. Murphy's name is here at the bottom. And your very own plaque to take home with you and hang on your wall. And then, of course, because he is clearly Team Rhetoric, we have a Team Rhetoric shirt.
This is the best part of all.
If you need a different size, we do have that as well. So the title of the talk this evening is The End of the World as We Know It, Civic Dialogue, War Rhetoric, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm honored this evening to do this introduction, to introduce the Kurt Ritter Lecture in Political Rhetoric, if I don't get attacked by the microphone. The annual lecture is, of course, named for Dr. Kurt Ritter. He's a founding member of our department, and it honors Dr. Ritter's work in American public address and political rhetoric. Our speaker this evening is Dr. John Murphy. He's an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Murphy's research focuses on the rhetoric of the U.S. presidency and contemporary politics, presidential war rhetoric, and campaign speeches. His work has had a profound impact on the study of American presidential rhetoric. For example, altering the way rhetorical scholars think about the role of the American Jeremiad in oratory. Over the last couple of days, I've been thinking about reflecting on my introduction for this evening. And I realized that I cannot remember the first time I met Dr. Murphy in person, although I think it was at a conference, probably. That's usually how we meet, right? I'm the stalker graduate student. Some of you might have done that as well. I do, however, remember the first time I met Dr. Murphy through his scholarship. And to tell that story, I actually have to tell you a little bit about my family, which seems strange, but it's going to come back around. When I was growing up, my parents encouraged my sister and I to read. And being a parent myself now, I've actually asked them of this, why it was the way it was. And it turns out it was a focused effort on their part to engender a love of reading in our lives. And so one of the ways that my parents did this is that we had dinner conversations about the things that we were reading. And it felt sometimes like a test, but most of the time, we were engaged in questions about the main themes of the book that we were reading. We were giving mini book reports. Sometimes they'd even read the same books. And if you're interested in a really kind of fascinating family communication study, you should have paid attention when my mother read V.C. Andrews with my sister. That conversation was not pretty. But the legacy of these early conversations actually is that throughout my life, we've continued to talk about what each other is reading, which I think is kind of a fabulous way to engage your family members. So every time we read something that we're interested in, we share it with each other. And as you might imagine, for me anyway, graduate school was particularly fun for this. I sent my parents any number of essays that I was reading that I thought that they would be interested in. And so here's where we circle back to Dr. Murphy. I sent my dad a set of readings that I had recently done for a seminar. And in that set, it included John's 1990 essay published in Quarterly Journal of Speech, A Time of Shame and Sorrow, Robert F. Kennedy and the American Jeremiad. And I remember, I knew my dad was done reading because he called me immediately and he said, "That Murphy essay, JJ, that was fantastic." Dr. Murphy's essay actually became a reference point for us as a family. And in particular, it was about what rhetorical scholars do. And Dr. Murphy, of course, does it very well. So you'll be glad to know that my dad has read everything you've published. And he has questions. I tell that story, though, because I think what's remarkable about it, at least for me as a budding scholar, is that John is a it's rare to encounter a scholar of such ability, right? Someone who has the insight and the excellence, and who is also just the sort of person that you'd like to welcome into your home and your family. So my dad was right. Dr. Murphy is fantastic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Murphy.
Thank you so much, JJB, which is, I understand your nickname and I love this, so I'm going to use it all the time now. Thank you very much for that introduction and for everything you've done at this conference. And my thanks join everybody at this conference because they have certainly, people have done a remarkable job. I always love being here at Texas A&M. I am a three-peat person as well, joining Jay and some others, much less all of the other presidency conferences I've done at one time or another. And I often feel very much at home because of all of the network connections that I have here to speak in organizational communication terms. And so I've spent nearly the last 20 years at the University of Georgia and the University of Illinois. And there are such connections to them that I can go woof, 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 and there are a large number of people who know what I'm talking about. And I can say ILL, and they know what to do. So it's a joy to be back here. I love speaking at Texas A&M, and I'm very honored to be giving the Kurt Ritter lecture. It's wonderful Jen cited what she did, because the essay she cited was actually deeply influenced by Kurt. It came out of my dissertation, which studied the American Jeremiad, and Kurt Ritter's essay on presidential nomination acceptance speeches as Jeremiads was deeply formative in my thought, and it has continued to help shape my thought all the way through my 2011 essay on Barack Obama and the American Covenant. So all of that is to say that to be able to be here and speak in Kurt's name and at his lecture is a tremendous honor. I'm very pleased to do so. I just wanted to say a moment here of where I'm coming from, because I think we all come from academic and scholarly backgrounds, and this is one of those conferences that actually crosses subfields in our discipline. So I wanted to just briefly explain, I'm a rhetorical critic. And like James Boyd White, I believe that our life is a life of language. And that means that of necessity, we use words that are not our own. We inherit our languages. And we need to try to find ways to have those languages make sense to other people, and to try to have those languages past address the problems of the present. As a result from that, I get particularly interested in my bias as a critic, is to explore the ways in which orators deal with the past. That is, how they have to rework, refigure, put together anew the genres, the traditions, the languages, the terms that they have inherited. And so a good deal of what I do is to try to figure out how these allusions work, how these genres clash, how philosophies come together in public speech, and open up possibilities for revising the circumstance that we're in. And so part of my bias when I think about what we're talking about here is that leadership consists of being able to adapt those languages to the circumstances that we face. And if you look at the work that I've done, that's what I've tended to focus on. That is, how do orators find ways to mix and match languages such that they make sense in our current circumstance? And that, to me, is the mark of rhetorical leadership. Equally important part of what that means is that dialogue is not something that occurs only between people or in the space between people or among people. It occurs within individual texts. Texts are dynamic. They are not static entities. They are always reaching for an audience. And so as I begin to look at this particular speech, I am deeply concerned with the ways that it incorporates and reaches for other speeches in the American tradition. I'm also particularly interested in public texts. And the reason for that is that there's a lot at stake in a public text. And perhaps never more so were the stakes ever higher than in the speech that I'm looking at today. That is John F. Kennedy's October 22nd, 1962 address on the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a speech that is, to say the least, not been universally praised. James Giglio says it raised the level of tension appreciably in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And honestly, that's about the best response you can find to the address. Gary Wills contends John Kennedy did not think of power as the recruiting of people's opinion, but as the manipulation of their response by aristocrats who saw what the masses could not see. Relying on his own talent and will, the leader prods them against their instincts toward duty and empire. Theodore Wint agrees, the writing of this and other presidential crisis speeches. In situations the president perceives as critical, the president sees himself as Caesar, and therefore uses an aristocratic form of rhetoric to justify his declarations of action. This perception and this use of rhetorical forms are unsuitable to a democratic society. Michael Beschloss claims the address was probably the most alarming ever delivered by an American president. In contrast, I believe the president's speech was remarkably controlled. He orchestrated the emotions of the audience so as to build support for quarantine of the island, a limited use of American military power for limited purposes. That should matter because he managed a rhetorical problem plaguing nuclear-era presidents. In a nation that firmly believes there is no substitute for victory, in a time in which victory would lead to mutual annihilation, how does a president justify a substitute? In this case, I argue that Kennedy adopted the norms of forensic address, modeled the appropriate emotional expression, and cultivated the habit of timely deliberation. From a wider perspective, this case also raises the question of the role passion should play in civic dialogue. And we've had several presentations over the course of this conference that have tried to talk about passion and emotion. War always invokes these concerns, and the critiques of JFK focus on this issue. They argue he inappropriately roused emotion, prodded otherwise peaceful Americans toward empire, and assumed dictatorial power at a time crying out for democratic deliberation. I think an examination of the text will suggest otherwise. To support my claim, I briefly explore the role of civic emotion in public speech, contextualize the address in terms of liberal democratic practice, U.S. war rhetoric and its immediate situation, and finally, turn to John Kennedy's textual cultivation of appropriate emotions. Along the way, I will keep in mind this dual imperative. I have no critics, so I can talk for as long as I want. On the other hand, as Kevin said the other night, I am all that stands between you and food. And as a result of that, I will certainly be cautious, because I do not want to be ripped by a hungry mob. Thomas Farrell defines rhetoric as the art, the fine and useful art, of making things matter. Elaborating on this admittedly cryptic observation, he locates rhetoric's art in its capacity to engage us with the world, to make its appearances near and dear to us, to help us care. One could hardly find a better definition of rhetoric with which to begin a discussion of the role of pathos or civic emotion in public deliberation. Farrell focuses our attention on attention and attachment. Amid life's hullabaloo, how do we come to care? If deliberation, as James Awney wrote, seeks to identify, evaluate, and justify useful courses of action under conditions of uncertainty, then Farrell suggests that we must care about those courses of action. In addition, rhetoric speaks in uncertainty to things that may or may not matter. Out of perishable circumstance, incomplete knowledge, infallible human action, orators try to mark a direction that will likely lead to a good result. In such predicaments, there is no scientific or philosophical truth. Rather, deliberation tries to deal as reliably as possible with contingent issues. In other words, the Aristotelian tradition of rhetoric persistently suggests that in uncertain situations, audiences need to feel good about their decisions, both to grant assent to them and to put them into practice. Yet Aristotle explicitly and famously condemned emotional appeals, arguing that they make crooked the judges. And Jay certainly talked about this. Jeffrey Walker notes that Aristotle's language there was nasty. Perversion, pandering, and in the Greek, even pimping, characterized the indictment. We're all pimps. And it's a hard world. And suggest that pathetic appeals are unethical. So how to square this circle? I think the answer lies with the audience. In his study of the rhetoric, Eugene Garver notes that the role of emotions in rhetoric follows from the role in practical decisions, that of making, judging, determining. If reason alone cannot affect a decision, then emotions will have a role. Now, given that a situation of pure reason is surpassingly rare in civic life, Congress, pathos works to put a complex, confusing world into focus. Walker also emphasizes the finishing role of emotion in debate. He links it to catharsis. That term appears in medical and religious texts, the former of which sees it as a purgation of unhealthy elements from the body, and the latter of which defines it as a purification, or as I see it, a sharpening and clarifying of an otherwise indeterminate realm of appearances. As the world comes into focus, the appropriate action becomes apparent. Walker's argument reflects the logos bias of the Aristotelian corpus and commentary. Like W.W. Fortenbaugh, for example, Walker, Garver, Farrell make of pathos a reasoned response to rhetorical appeals. They root emotion in cognition. Now, personal experience may make one dubious about such assertions, such as when you fall off a bike and your mom isn't home. She's at some conference. And Lacanian critical models, for instance, move in an entirely different direction. Yet the classical perspective offers one advantage in that it concerns civic emotions, not personal ones. Garver notes that Aristotle's discussion of fear concerns only those anxieties arising from communal human life. Snakes, however scary, however ubiquitous in the state of Texas, are nowhere to be found in his discussion. There is no doubt, as Aristotle and his commentators suggest, that emotions include physical reactions. But as an emotional appeal, as a rhetorical appeal, pathos both arouses and justifies emotions. In this view, a pathetic appeal always contains a more or less normative claim. Garver writes, emotions carry with them the judgment that the emotion is appropriate. The speaker makes an audience feel ashamed by showing that they should be ashamed. And when I am convinced that I should not be angry, my anger dissipates. Orators invite audiences to feel in ways that fit communal life. These feelings are contestable because audiences must agree for them to move from potential to reality. The dynamis, capacity of rhetoric, comes into play at this moment. In short, emotions play an ethically significant role in public deliberation because they make determinant or make real decisions that further the flourishing of a community. I believe they do so on two levels. In terms of the situation's pragmatic demands, pathetic appeals seek to alter judgments by crafting the audience's frame of mind, the feelings that it attaches to alternatives. To do so, rhetors make public private emotions through conventional form. And conventional form is the way, I think, to respond to what Adria was saying earlier when she was quoting Jim, is the way you attach intentions to result. That is, form regularizes this. So one great problem facing any speaker is the need to make civic ineffable feelings. To do so, rhetors renew or recite the available means of emotional appeal, the cultural scripts or frames that we comprising the community's social knowledge. Inchoate feelings assume familiar forms, runs recognizable as fear or faith, as when converts offer a witness to amazing grace, a conventional performance if ever there was one. The danger is that convention devolves into cliché, that audiences only feel as they have always felt, and for those who have always mattered. But pathos possesses the capacity, Aristotle notes, to make others' misfortunes seem close to ourselves. As we see them, pathos takes us outside of our own immediacy, in Farrell's words, from the neighborhood to the moral community. Thus Sarah McLachlan dog ads, right? Where you feel so horrible that you want to switch the channel. That is, it takes us outside of our moral neighborhood. That feels legitimate because such appeals, like the enthemy, invoke the norms and forms of everyday life to firm up a frame of mind. In that witness I spoke of, speaker and congregation are transformed in a recurrent mutual covenant of faith and affirm a new and continuing choice to live together. As my example shows, however, such rhetoric occurs within cultures and institutions. Yes, the rhetorician's about to talk about an institution. The convert expresses a familiar faith, sanctified in substance and style by the larger religious culture, e.g. evangelicalism, and perhaps an institutional church, such as the Assemblies of God. That is the second level on which pathos realizes communal decisions. Recurrent performances, such as this one, reconstitute institutions and shape communities, but they also run into recalcitrant emotions that already occupy this terrain. The ways in which speakers recurrently arouse and justify emotions help to constitute the chords of public sympathy that come to mark a culture, institution, or nation. How we feel about ourselves, our community, and our world emerges from discursive acts that constrain and enable subsequent performances. In summary, I want to argue, pathos performs rhetoric's art. It makes things matter. The ways in which it does so are shaped by the belief that rhetoric is an art of public thought, and so pathos is a civic emotion, the frame of mind attached to public judgments. Pathetic appeals are ethical because they are justified by public speech, and they work because they use conventional form to bring into focus the choices open to audiences. Their recurrent use defines the community's emotional character. People learn the conventions of emotion in scripts, and those partly constitute the cultures and institutions that shape public life. This then is the view of pathos I can force out of the classical tradition. But what happens when that ancient republican polity that gave birth to this concept becomes the liberal democracy of late modernity? Of course, I posed a question that the foregoing synthesis is likely already answered. We live in a liberal democracy. The classical rhetorical tradition we see reflects those biases. In particular, the desire to root emotion in cognition emerges from the spread of liberal democratic norms. There is no single definition of liberalism, but theorists tend to identify liberalism with an essential principle: the importance of the freedom of the individual. Above all, this is a belief in the importance of moral freedom, of the right to be treated and a duty to treat others as ethical subjects. This is of particular concern when it comes to war. The great fear is that emotion suppresses ethical or rational judgments and wrongly guides the nation, an experience we certainly haven't had in the last decade. As a result, Robert Harriman and John Lukacs argue liberals seek a governing rationality that subordinates emotional reaction to the deliberate analytical assessment of interests and constraints, means and ends, and other objective features of the political environment. This suppression extends from oratory to punditry to rhetorical theory. As the Enlightenment's child, liberalism believes that people are morally and intellectually self-sufficient, that the world is not mythically mysterious, but yields its secrets to thoughtful investigation, and that an intellectual, reasonable community, a graduate seminar, Tasha's graduate seminar, can most effectively make public policy free from prejudice and passion. Of course, most political controversies, as Harriman and Lukacs acknowledge, are awash in emotion. If one regards the United States as a liberal democracy, then their thesis that such regimes suppress passion finds little support. Rather, I want to argue that liberal democracies channel civic emotion, bringing reason and passion into tension. To show that, I turn to President Kennedy's generic obstacle, because if nothing else suffices to complicate the claim that technical reason and muted affect police public speech in this country, then presidential war rhetoric ought to do the job. In point of fact, liberalism evolved, at least in part, from the problem of war. Those of a literary bent might recall Shakespeare's incisive portrayal of this issue in Henry V, Act 1, Scene 2. The gift of some tennis balls from the Dauphin of France so enraged the king that he swore, "We will, in France, by God's grace, play a set shall strike his father's crown into the hazard. I will rise there with so full of glory that I will dazzle all the eyes of France." Although dynastic issues certainly came into play, Henry's outraged masculinity emerged as a precipitating event of the second round of the 100 Years' War. By contrast, liberals believed one man's quest for so full of glory should not turn a continent into a slaughterhouse. Now, it's important to remember, I think, the original justifications for commercial society amidst our condemnations of it over the course of this weekend. Stephen Holmes notes that the principal aim of liberals who wrote favorably of self-interest was to bridle self-destructive and self-destructive passions, to reduce the social prestige of mindless male violence, to induce people to act rationally instead of hot-bloodedly or deferentially, and to focus on material goals such as economic wealth instead of spiritual goals such as avenging a perceived slight or compelling neighbors to attend church. Liberals believed that commercial society and predictable state authority had powerful psychological effects and could conceivably knock some modicum of sense into mankind. Self-interest channels fervor such that people will fall in love with their smartphones and disdain a bloody cause greater than self. John McCain. And yet there lies a contradiction at the heart of this project. Liberal democracies take seriously the charge to treat others as ethical subjects. And like James Stewart in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, seek to universalize liberal democratic norms to everyone, even when that requires the John Waynes to shoot the Lee Marvins of the world. The universalizing impulse at the heart of Enlightenment liberalism encourages an imperial instinct. On an instrumental level, the liberal theory of international relations suggests that commercial regimes do not often war on each other. The more of them there are, the more probable world peace. On a normative level, people possess natural rights. Liberals should undermine regimes that deny such rights and support those that respect such rights. Thus, liberal imperialism. To be fair, all governments need to defend themselves, and prudential analysis sometimes restrains expansive desires. The American experience, however, indicates that this is a consummation more devoutly to be wished for than to be expected. Therefore, a language of war. Article 2 of the Constitution identifies the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Article 1 may reserve the power to declare war and raise armies for the Congress, but it has become commonplace to note that the President dominates the Congress when it comes to foreign policy. The President speaks with a single voice, maintains the capacity to act with dispatch, dominates foreign policy, commands access to secret intelligence, and wields executive authority. As a result, the constitutional model of war, in which the President asks for permission before going to war, has now given way to the current model, in which the President asks for forgiveness after war. That is to say, presidents justify force after the fact or so near to that as to make no real difference. Such justifications enact the liberal democratic tension between reason and emotion. As Carl and Force Campbell and Kathleen Hall Jamieson note, the founders hoped that the reciprocal process implied by the Constitution would ensure that the decision to go to war would be thoughtful, not impulsive. The President would request a declaration of war. Congress would consider. The community would debate. Inflamed passions would have time to cool in the cup of deliberation. Presidential war rhetoric retains a trace of this concern. Presidents argue that the momentous decision to resort to force is deliberate, the product of thoughtful consideration, and thus Scott's discussion yesterday of just war theory. They emphasize the need for rationality, claim there is no alternative, narrate futile diplomatic efforts, or even emphasize the sleepless nights and personal agony caused by the request, read some Woodrow Wilson sometime, all in an effort to show that war is the only reasonable choice. But personal slights, tennis balls, are strictly forbidden in this cultural frame. That is not the case with public slights. The reasons for action flow from a dramatic narrative, one that links argumentation to exhortation. The narrative not only gives reasons for war, it also constitutes Americans as a united community. These stories generally claim that a threat imperils the nation, and indeed civilization itself, that the threat emanates from the acts of an identifiable enemy, and that despite patient search for alternatives, the threat necessitates a forceful, immediate response. The presidents arouse the righteous anger of the American people, detailing the horrors and humiliations imposed upon the nation and the world by an evil enemy, America. And at these times, it's always America must act. For Congress and the American people to say no has been unlikely. The emotions these stories invoke makes resistance even more implausible. Yet it's also important to note that war has nearly always been a rational choice for the United States. This is a most dangerous nation, to coin a phrase, one that has displaced its major hemispheric and world rivals, Great Britain, France, Mexico, Spain, and Germany, in battle. Since the first colonists came ashore, Americans have fought a war roughly once every 20 years for the last 400 years, and have become the most powerful nation on earth. Americans support a level of military expenditure and a rate of deployment unthinkable to the rest of the world. As Walter Russell Mead argues, this Jacksonian school of foreign policy matters greatly. For Gary Wills to say that otherwise peaceful Americans need to be prodded into empire is an extraordinary misreading of U.S. history. In other words, when Americans perceive a threat, their default emotional and logical reaction is to destroy that enemy with a remorseless fury, even when, as William Tecumseh Sherman demonstrated, the enemy is us. The Cold War proved no exception. If, as I have argued, repeated performances craft a community's emotional character and authorize appropriate responses to situations, then JFK faced occupied terrain in 1962. President Truman proclaimed Soviet evil in his March 12, 1947 call for aid to Greece and Turkey, and scarcely altered his vision of the enemy afterward. Although President Eisenhower tried to ease tensions, his efforts failed. He said in his farewell address, "We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method." I love that word, insidious. It's a snake. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of infinite duration. Think of that. In 59, Eisenhower was saying the Soviet Union is infinite. Needless to say, John Kennedy spoke in the same manner, although he too sought opportunities to ease tensions. In short, the nearly 200-year history of presidential war rhetoric conditioned American citizens to respond swiftly and brutally to perceived threats, and for 15 years, public discourse of all sorts, and presidential rhetoric in particular, made the Soviets into the most dangerous threat ever faced by the United States. But if we believe with Kenneth Burke that rhetorical form is the creation and satisfaction of an appetite in an auditor's mind, then post-war Americans, like the Rolling Stones, could get no satisfaction. Nuclear weapons changed everything. Neither President Truman nor President Eisenhower could win the Korean War, and Ike stood by while Soviet tanks crushed Hungarian democracy in 1956. John Kennedy's first briefing on war strategy clarified the problem. His aide, Walter Rostow, later wrote, "The plan he inherited called for devastating, indiscriminately, China, Russia, Eastern Europe. It was an orgiastic, Wagnerian plan, and he was determined from that moment to get the plan changed so he would have total control of it. It forecast the virtual incineration of the United States and Europe. The 38 flip charts, precursor to our beloved PowerPoint, the 38 flip charts detailed how the Joint Chiefs of Staff would destroy two continents. JFK famously remarked to Secretary of State D. Rusk as they left, "And we call ourselves the human race." To finish a war as envisioned by war rhetoric would end all rhetoric in the nuclear era. Nuclear weapons ruled out the Jacksonian impulse. President Kennedy encountered that dilemma on October 16, 1962. The previous day, reconnaissance flights had discovered Soviet missile installations in Cuba, and he determined the next day that they could not remain. Initially, Kennedy's advisors believed that they had to bomb the sites and perhaps follow with an invasion of the island. Over the next few days, the president decided the bombing campaign posed too great a risk of immediate escalation in nuclear war and chose instead to quarantine the island, publicize the problem, and persuade the Soviets to remove the missiles. He announced that plan to the American people on Monday, October 22nd, 1962. President Kennedy spoke from the Oval Office that evening, and for those used to 21st century presidential productions, it's important to understand the cultural norms crafting his delivery and its interpretation. The Oval Office was once the favored venue for all presidential crisis speeches, but today's world has dispersed. It offers no center. Presidents include physical movement and live audiences in their public address, and one can well imagine a contemporary JFK speaking from Key West with an iconic Hemingway beach cottage as a backdrop, gesturing to those horrendous missiles just over the horizon. The emotional difference in register between these two scenarios is profound. The Oval Office emphasizes control and rationality. The president is at the center of events, weighing and evaluating the evidence as it comes into the White House. He directs events. Key West offers a different tone. Kennedy on the beach would emphasize the proximity of the threat, not the controlled response to it, and that would have intensified the address's affect, particularly the fear and fury aroused by the Soviet action. As it was, JFK sought to channel those emotions in part through his delivery. The president spoke with a dark backdrop, in the presidential work uniform at the time, a black suit, narrow black tie, white shirt. He spoke seated or behind a desk with a desk podium in front of him. There was no teleprompter. He carefully read and turned each page of the address. Only when he quoted Soviet lies did his voice intensify and reflect the anger he surely felt. In short, little or nothing in his delivery indicated that he sought to terrify the American people. Instead, he sought to convict the Soviets in the court of American and world opinion. In most ways, his speech asks to be understood as a forensic address. One of the three Aristotelian genres, forensic or courtroom speech, deals with rule violations. How does the community deal with those who have done wrong? Traditionally, forensic address focuses on the goal of justice, adjudicates a past event, employs stasis theory to invent arguments from probability, logos, induces the audience to adopt a good frame of mind for judgment, pathos, develops a view of character such that this sort of person, OJ, would do that sort of thing, slash people, ethos. Of course, Kennedy did not speak in a court, but the Aristotelian genres are notoriously permeable, and I contend the president symbolically created a court. That effort began early. The opening lines nodded toward the narrative common to war rhetoric. The president noted the government had, as promised, monitored the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Yet he did not follow with a tale of Soviet evil. Instead, he said, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. By doing so, he focused this part of the speech on a question of fact, the first kind of stasis. As a mode of invention, the traditional stases are questions designed to allow advocates to identify the key issues in a dispute. They're arranged hierarchically such that one usually needs to answer the prior questions before reaching the others. The question of fact asks whether something exists. Did it happen? The question of definition asks what kind of thing or event it is. How do we classify? The question of quality evaluates the act. Is it right or wrong? Finally, the question of jurisdiction concerns the forum. Is this an appropriate place to judge? In analytical mode, stasis theory can reveal the issues in dispute, but in prosecutorial mode, the questions of stasis can remorselessly build a rational case against a defendant. That is precisely what Kennedy did. Upon receiving those first preliminary reports, I directed that our surveillance be stepped out. And now, having confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. That is, they had surveyed the evidence almost like a grand jury, and now he's going to bring it to you for the conviction. The next two paragraphs establish the facts. a case later reinforced by Ambassador Adlai Stevenson's dramatic presentation to the United Nations and the photographs that were both used in that speech and published in nearly every newspaper and magazine in the country. In fact, accurate photographs as opposed to Colin Powell. There were two types of installations, medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles. The former could reach much of the southeastern United States, he said. The latter could reach most of the major cities of the Western Hemisphere. Kennedy here tried to unify the Western Hemisphere against the Soviet threat, but he never detailed the horrors of nuclear war or the evils of communism, as one might expect in war rhetoric. For example, like FDR's 1940 Arsenal of Democracy address, Kennedy shrunk space, so the threat became proximate and urgent to those in this hemisphere. But JFK's speech lacked the vivacity characterizing FDR's effort. Instead, these two paragraphs established one key fact. The Soviets had nuclear weapons in Cuba. He next sought primarily to define or classify the Soviet act. He argued that the urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction. Note how early we get the phrase weapons of mass destruction? Constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warnings to the Soviets on September 4 and 13. The deployments made Cuba into a strategic base, and he consistently labeled the missiles strategic. He justified that label through definition and amplification. They were large, long-range, clearly offensive. The dissociative pair of defensive strategic defined the missiles. The Soviets had upset the strategic balance because they claimed to deploy only defensive missiles, but in truth, they had installed weapons of mass destruction. Of course, definition or classification implies evaluation. A murder is wrong. The language Kennedy used evaluated the quality of the Soviet deployment. Their action threatened the peace and security of this hemisphere. They acted in flagrant and deliberate defiance of treaties and agreements, and the accumulative power of that list of covenants I read amplified the Soviet criminal offense. Yet featuring those agreements gave them presence and bound all parties in a web of such agreements, highlighting previous Soviet decisions to abide by international norms. To give presence to such ideas is to attach emotion to them. Kennedy featured the Soviet violations. Now, to conclude the sentence with his warnings might seem too personal, right? It might seem like tennis balls, except that they had accepted his admonitions in those weeks before the crisis. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation. To support that claim, Kennedy used two examples. He noted that the size of the deployment made clear that it had been planned for some months. Yet the Soviets had earlier assured the world that they had no intention of deploying such weapons. JFK quoted their promises directly. He concluded that statement was false. More recently, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko had reassured the president only last Thursday that the weapons were defensive, and he again quoted Gromyko to that effect. That statement was also false. In both cases, the Soviets had lied. They had lied to his face, to the President of the United States. Such an act seemingly required retaliation. It creates anger, but a full retaliatory response, as it were, would end the world. JFK then sought to channel that response, and the ways in which he did so rested in part on the style with which he accused the Soviets. His delivery intensified here, but it did so in a manner familiar to Americans. As the chief counsel and witness for the prosecution, the president had tracked the Soviets. He knew about those missiles when he met with Gromyko. He gave the foreign minister every opportunity to recant. He did not do so. To an American audience that had made Perry Mason the #5 show on television that past spring, JFK's performance made for a compelling, familiar moment. The Soviets had claimed innocence, and the president had caught them out as surely as did Raymond Burr to similar criminals every week. Wahaha! Kennedy found a conventional form, the courtroom drama, with which he could satisfy communal expectations. And significantly, Perry Mason does not wage nuclear war. The president complemented his use of conventional form with procedural arguments. Soviet deceit was not merely an insult. It resonated more widely because of the context. He stated that no one could tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, but nuclear weapons intensified that concern. He said, "We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents a sufficient challenge to a nation's security to constitute maximum peril. Nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace." Nor was this only JFK's view. For years, he said, the Soviet Union and the United States, recognizing this fact, have deployed nuclear weapons with great care, never upsetting the precarious status quo which ensured these weapons would not be used in the absence of some vital challenge. The liberal emphasis on transparent and fair procedures here came to the forefront. Nuclear weapons were different, and it's important to note what a change this was from the Eisenhower administration. As a military commander, Eisenhower saw nuclear weapons as weapons. That is why Kennedy inherited that orgiastic plan. If the Soviets moved through the Fulda Gap into West Germany, Eisenhower was going to nuke them all. Because weapons were weapons, we used weapons in times of war. Kennedy argued nuclear weapons were different. Their speed and power were such that they had to be visible, apparent, and open to all at all times. That is, the only way deterrence works is if you see them. If they're secret, that means that they can be used, and that's precisely what deterrence seeks to avoid. And so that becomes his argument. Subsequently, he issued his most emotional attacks on the deployment, and they focused on its invisibility. It was a secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup. It was a sudden, clandestine decision. It marked a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever again to be trusted by friend or foe. Now, this line shifted the audience's concern to character. The issue of timing, or kairos, will come to the forefront later, but it played a significant role in the construction of Soviet character, and in contrast to that, the American ethos. Note that JFK portrayed the Soviet action as a sharp break from the past. It seemed impossible that a once responsible nation could do this, and every account of JFK's reaction to the missile's discovery was his disbelief, filled with F-bombs all over the place. I can't believe the effing Soviets did this effing thing, what are they gonna? He was shocked. And so it seemed impossible that a once responsible nation could do this. JFK suggested in this speech then that this act was an exception to their behavioral norm. By contrast, Steve Goldswig and George Giannisopoulos contend that JFK crafted the Soviets as an outlaw actor in the world community, and that assessment reflects the usual critical judgment of this speech. In fact, the president did not make an ontological claim. The Soviets were not outlaws, but the act broke the law. There's a difference. President Kennedy criticized conduct, but not character, in contrast to speeches from Truman and Eisenhower. This reinforces a liberal notion of legal procedure. An advocate should not engage in ad hominem attacks, but rather prove that a specific act violated the law and seek redress or punishment for that act. Although JFK referenced a Soviet desire to dominate other nations, The speech contained no attack on the USSR comparable to Truman's famous contrast between two ways of life in his 1947 speech. In short, Kennedy shaped the audience's interpretation of the Soviet deployment as an ill-advised emotional outburst, one uncharacteristic of the Soviet Union in particular and a great power in general. He condemned the act and defined as his unswerving objective only the elimination of these missiles, not regime change in the USSR or Cuba. Such a goal was consonant with American character as Kennedy created it. If the sudden, swift, clandestine, irresponsible, provocative, unjustified Soviet decision emerged in Perelman's terms as an anti-model, then the president could urge Americans to act in the opposite way. The audience knew in their bones the dialectical pair, Soviet, evil, America, good. JFK portrayed U.S. policy as one of patience and restraint. American acts, then, will flow from and reflect the identity of a nation opposed to war, but also true to our word. How might that needle be threaded? In one of his rare stylistic flourishes, the president set the standard for his policy. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be as ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. Kennedy's structure iconically framed the balance he sought in the world, and the striking metaphor with its biblical overtones acknowledged the risks even patience and restraint offered. In addition, he shaped the audience's frame of mind by preparing them for a restrained policy, and he did so by contrasting that to the sudden, deceptive, and clandestine work of the Soviets. His enunciation and his policy sounded more like the summary judgment of a court than an apocalyptic call to war. Kennedy carefully numbered his points, 1 through 7, emphasized the limits of his actions, cited the authorities which justified his moves, called upon Chairman Khrushchev to reverse his policy, and listed the fora in which the United States was prepared to meet to resolve the conflict. With one exception, this section sounded nothing like war rhetoric. At each stage, he emphasized contingency, the ways in which events might or might not lead to specific ends. By doing so, the president featured the role of kairos and choice in human affairs. Kairos means timing. Rhetorical theorists emphasize the choice of a timely moment to enter or transform a debate, an external sense of time. When should one speak? You see the opening, you gotta go. My former colleague Debbie Hawley, now at Penn State, makes the analogy between athletics and rhetoric in the first book, and it's kind of, as people are playing right now, the move a point guard makes when they see the opening, go to the basket. That's the moment we speak. That's the external sense of kairos. There is also an internal sense of time with text. Speeches unfold in time, and with strategy and luck, shape the audience's sense of time. As I've noted, President Kennedy sought to do that, beginning with his focus on the fact of the Soviet deployment and ending with the argument that we must meet this aggressive conduct. But here he argues the United States would begin a delicate dance. It would take steps. At each stage, it would assess the results of those steps and the Soviet reaction. If the Soviets behaved badly, war might result. If the Soviets behaved well, we get out of this thing. He announced first a strict quarantine of all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba. A quarantine was not a blockade, which under international law is an act of war. The next 3 steps promised surveillance of Cuba and indicated that if offensive military preparations continue, then further reaction will be justified. That included a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union if missiles were launched from Cuba, the most militant statement in the speech, and the one you always see in X-Men movies and other kinds of things. Each of these steps flowed from a bad reaction from the Soviets. In the final 3 steps, the climax of the argument, JFK sketched a good outcome, calling for negotiations and indicating American willingness to do so under the auspices of the Organization of American States, the United Nations Security Security Council or a joint meeting at any time and in any place. If the Soviets would do so, the superpowers might transcend Cuba and join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and transform the history of man. It is important to understand that Kennedy positioned the quarantine as the first move in a continuing relationship. The two scenarios that followed flowed from likely Soviet reactions. He constituted a contingent world, one in which we held the agency to start or forestall nuclear war. This was a reciprocal relationship, not the doomsday scenario offered by those 38 flip charts. In addition, JFK's plan accorded with American character as he had sketched it, and with previous perceptions of Soviet character. He concluded, "Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere and, we hope, around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved." As he often did, President Kennedy paradoxically used antithetical language to transcend conflict and make a counterfactual world of peace and freedom. Happily, those lines did not become as ashes in his mouth, and we lived to tell the tale. It is one worth the telling. The Cuban Missile Crisis lingers in popular memory as the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, the one time in which a full nuclear exchange seemed terribly possible. Yet its impossibility also mattered now and then. From the first moments of his presidency, John Kennedy believed that no one could win a nuclear war, and most people now share that assessment, although many did not do so then, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In other words, the nuclear war was not, and is not, in an important sense, rhetorical. It is not a contingent matter, any more than is the law of gravity. If the missiles fly, the world dies. The great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr understood more clearly than most that nuclear weapons posed a tragic dilemma, not a policy debate. Although Western civilization was confident of its virtue, it must yet hold atomic bombs ready for use so as to prevent a possible world conflagration. It may actually make the conflict more inevitable by this threat, and yet it cannot abandon the threat. Beyond that, if war should break out, the West would be in danger of destroying itself as a moral culture in the process of defending itself physically. Writing in 1952, Niebuhr could envision that something might survive, but there was always the danger that it would not. And what of our virtue then? Moreover, if one of the superpowers did survive, it would likely be so preponderant and unchallenged that its world rule would almost certainly violate basic standards of justice. And Niebuhr's view of human nature, his belief in original sin, I think is worth considering for those of us engaged in democratic deliberation and civic dialogue and the rest. There is an assumption in those of the perfectibility of human beings, an almost social gospel assumption that says we can make it all better. The words of Reinhold Niebuhr stand in stark contrast to that. After living through the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the Second World War, Niebuhr contended that our desire to control the world, to eat of the apple and be as God, was a tremendous challenge to any notion that we could get away from demonization. And so I think Niebuhr is a fundamental challenge to some of these perspectives. He understood that in the tragic dilemma posed by nuclear weapons, justice, rather than expediency, was the only fit matter for civic dialogue. And so when John Kennedy confronted the danger Niebuhr only envisioned, the president made it a matter of justice. The text evinced the norms of forensic address, asking the audience to assess the president's policy not in terms of its expediency, for that did not matter, but in terms of his justice, which he made matter. Through the questions of stasis, JFK made a prima facie case that the Soviet deployment was an unjust act. The Soviet act, in fact, was so manifestly unjust that it required the U.S. to grasp the dilemma so effectively analyzed by Niebuhr. To preserve the possibility of a just order, the U.S. must threaten a most unjust act, nuclear war. Yet it must do so in a rational, sequential fashion, one that offered Soviet participation at each step of this deadly dance, for that was the only just alternative. To let loose the dogs of war, to engage the rhetorical forms that traditionally justified American military action, would not only be inexpedient, but unjust. By its nature, nuclear war required another approach. Kennedy then aroused anger at the deployment, but he did so with conventional forms that channeled the fury toward an institutional resolution. The president enmeshed the Soviet Union in a web of pacts and people that would not be easy to rend, all those accumulative lists. Equally important, he enmeshed his audience as well. For them to strike would be to act as the Soviets had inexplicably acted, and to destroy that which the Soviets threatened and which we were bound to defend. His discourse, in short, attached Americans' passion to the reversal of the Soviet action, not the eradication of the Soviet nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. We have time, I think, for questions, comments, conversation.
Give me a shout.
You can start, and then I'll get it to you.
Wait now. First, that was absolutely wonderful. So thank you for that. That was excellent. Second, I'm thinking back to the way you sort of set this entire thing up and offering the way that the speech has been read and what I think is your convincing reading of the speech. And I keep thinking about the distinction between the content of the speech and the fact that the speech exists at all. The difference between the speech and the speech act. How important is it that he gave the speech on a Monday evening, nationally broadcast? The fact that he felt he had to do this or found some strategic reason in doing it?
I think it was very important. And I think even the act of giving the speech, to a certain extent, refutes some of the argument of critics because he was involving Americans in public deliberation. But I have to say, part of what I cut from the oral presentation of this longer paper is my I think his choice in, you can't say his intentionality was to pick a forensic address. Hell, he didn't know what forensic address was. But to choose those topoi that we normally interpret as forensic address, that choice, on one level, you have to say in this situation, it's brilliant. I really think it was. On a second level, it's not deliberation. And so in a less catastrophic situation, when, for instance, we're committing to Iraq, or to Grenada, or to Lebanon, or all of the other things we've done since then, should we argue solely about the just nature of the act, or as I've argued in print elsewhere, we've got to think about the deliberative topoi that says whether this is an expedient or practical act? I have to say that this is a little bit unusual because it really was a nuclear war and the end of the world as we know it. Shout out to Athens, Georgia. That we were facing. And so Kennedy says, I'm reporting to the American people, which doesn't sound like he's deliberating with them. So I struggle with that. But the other thing I got to say, part of what the setup was designed to show is that people like Gary Bolsa have this notion that we're all just the most peaceful Americans who ever existed ever, and they have to so ignore the evidence of our history. Part of the interpretation of this speech that treats it negatively assumes that Americans were enormously peaceful, and I think that's just silly. And I think that our history demonstrates that Kennedy was standing in the way of a Jacksonian response, and that's why he shaped the speech as he did.
I think I could.
Oh,
You've invited this question 2 or 3 times during your presentation, so I feel duty-bound to ask it. If you did a parallel analysis of Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations justifying the Iraq invasion, what are the similarities and differences between those 2 speeches?
There are 2 levels in which I think you respond to that. The first one is war rhetoric has increasingly moved toward its epidemic elements. And the argument becomes, to be truly American, to affirm our communal identity, we need to blow somebody up. And that's what Colin Powell did, that's what George W. Bush did, as I've argued in print. That's what the administration did. That, to me, is highly problematic. Forensic address, I think, I would love to see deliberative in those instances. Let's talk about the policy. But forensic is certainly a preferable alternative, because in that, we're at least talking about whether this is a just act. The second level, of course, is that they lied. And Kennedy and Stevenson were not lying. And I think it's important to use the word lie in that circumstance, because people knew better. We now know they knew better. And they went ahead and told lies anyway. Because they thought it was justified, because clearly he would be a danger even if he wasn't a danger now, yada, yada, yada. Oh, the final thing I'd say is, one of the big differences between this and other war speeches, FDR and others, is that there's no personalization. Whenever Kennedy speaks of Khrushchev, it's Chairman Khrushchev, it's very respectful. You think of George H.W. Bush constantly referring to Saddam. I'm going to get you, Saddam. Where he's demonized, he's called a Hitler, he's diminished. Certainly FDR, if you read The Arsenal of Democracy and his other work, oh my God. And so, I'm not being partisan when I say that. There is a personalization in most war rhetoric that focuses our demonization on the particular leader of the other country. And the Gulf War rhetoric, both the first and second Gulf War, are excellent examples of that. Kennedy does none of that. There's no demonization of Chairman Khrushchev, and Castro is completely ignored in the address.
Someone else?
After you, Alphonse.
So one of the things that, first of all, thank you, that was a great talk. One of the things that brought to mind was one of the other presentations we heard yesterday about JFK as the first postmodern president. And I was wondering if your analysis, if you think that that kind of supports that idea, and that's why his war rhetoric was wholly different than that came before, and even some of that has come after.
Well, I very much like that presentation. I tend to try to resist those kinds of generalizations. I'm sort of more interested in how that plays out in specific contexts. And so I'm not sure whether I call it postmodern or not, but for instance, to connect to Jay's presentation, when you're talking about agonism, the general solution, as he noted, is transcendence. Democrats, Republicans, Americans. And so you transcend in order to overcome divisions, Kenneth Burke would teach us. And the trouble, as Jay notes, is that American is a kind of empty signifier in that circumstance. What John Kennedy does beautifully in another one of his speeches, the American University Address, is to overcome an agonism through a transcendence, but it's a transcendence of mortality, death related to nuclear weapons. The famous lines from American University that says, in the final analysis, we all share this same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We are all mortal. We all cherish our children. We are all mortal. That is, our transcendence is that we are all vulnerable. That's substantive. The reason we negotiate with the Soviets is not because we share some mythical substance or anything. It's because we could all die. And that's, an extraordinary, I think, rhetorical move. And that's why his American University Address still remains my favorite speech.
I wonder if we could take the logic of justice. Of course, with Niebuhr's justice is love, right? Mm-hmm. So King's famous conceptualization of that, justice is that which corrects against that which resists love, right? In this case, we had the threat of self-annihilation, and if you take it to the Syria case, where we had Obama draws the red line, etc., and it seems like that was an appeal to justice. It was an appeal to that which was rebelling against love, which is to say the slaughter of these innocents. Now we could say that he took too long to get in there, etc., etc. But is that a case of justice? And if it was an appeal to justice, least it minimized itself, it compromised in that sense. At least that's the critique, that's the critic, although we don't have weapons there anymore. What is that, just draw a comparison between those. Was Obama's speech a failure, or if so, why was it, or if it wasn't, why was it successful?
I think there's an interesting comparison to be drawn there because both Presidents Obama and Kennedy each sought a limited goal under limited circumstances. That is, Obama did not intervene until chemical weapons were used. He wished to remove the chemical weapons from the equation. Kennedy sought, even though at other times he did everything from exploding cigars to assassins to get rid of Cuba, of Castro at this moment. He did not seek regime change in Cuba. So each are seeking limited goals. My two responses to that on the immediate practical level are, I'm not one of those who thinks Obama's Syria speech was a failure. I think it was a success. And I base that on a couple of different things. One is that I find it passing strange that for decades people have attacked presidents for simply committing us to military action, including Obama in Libya, without consulting Congress. And then the one time a president announces that he's going to consult Congress, he's regarded as weak. Let's make up our minds, people. In a second way, he achieved his policy objective, which was a limited policy objective. On a broader level, in terms of the acts of justice and love, that's a really hard question. Part of what I guess I would contrast is an Niebuhrian view that says we live in an imperfect world, that there are going to be problems that we cannot resolve, and that people are always going to try to do these negative things. And somebody like Stanley Hauerwas, who would argue that love can be enacted within institutions, and that it's simply our failure to do that. And I think Hauerwas is wrong. And I think he's particularly wrong when it comes to, say, the church as an institution, which, priestly pedophilia should convince him of. But I think there are serious issues with that. So Obama is very consciously Niebuhrian. He said it. His Nobel Prize address is Niebuhrian as any foreign policy address delivered by an American president since Niebuhr was alive. So it's a rather extraordinary speech. And so yeah, I think Obama aims at justice. He's willing to accept half a loaf, which he regards as justice. He does not believe he can invoke the law of love. He does not believe he can make the whole world better.
Could the explanation of the inconsistency on consulting Congress be a function not of the president, but of the fact that Congress is now held in such low regard? No one can justify consulting them on anything, maybe a grocery list?
Yeah, I mean, that can be part of it. Kevin would probably know about this as well as anyone, and certainly Josh's advisor, my colleague John Lammers, has spent a good deal of time trying to talk about institutional legitimacy and how institutions work, and I am desperately trying to learn from Professor Lammers as I try to rethink notions of rhetorical presidency, which I'm starting to have serious doubts about. But there is a lack of institutional legitimacy, and Congress has been unable to convince us that they can do their jobs particularly well, and thus their legitimacy to act on public policy questions comes into serious question. And I think, and that is not true of the executive branch. And it's not true of the judicial branch, although they teetered on the edge of it in the Bush versus Gore decision. And so I think it's very necessary for Congress, especially the Senate, to rethink in some ways how they operate and what they do. And, I don't want to start to go into that whole long thing, but there's an institutional deficit.
I loved your talk. It took me a long time to come up with a question, but I knew I had to come up with one.
I would go home so
I
disappointed if you did not. And if it doesn't include the founders, my heart will break.
I can't think of anything related. Slightly. It's just slightly related. So I love the way you read this as a forensic speech and the way that you figure JFK as Perry Mason. Mm-hmm. Yeah. and watch
I
the
think
show.
Charlie and I might be the only people.
I-
He's not a burger. He's definitely.
Yeah, Josh Barter tweeted it already.
Okay.
Yeah, we're good. So but I love that, and I love thinking about, and this is something that came out at the Rhetoric of War pre-con. I don't know if anybody that's here was there at NCA. But the question of whether really the public can deliberate about war, and thinking about that in terms of nuclear crisis, and I love what you say about nuclear war being non-rhetorical, right? Like, that's it. It's just annihilation. By the end of the decade, right, people are protesting the war in Vietnam, and they're demanding like that role of deliberation. And so there's something interesting about that, like the way that the public wants to deliberate, at least in that decade, about war. I'm not sure if they do today, and if they do, I don't know if they can, because I think we moved past the rhetorical presidency to the post-rhetorical presidency. That's a whole other thing. And so the founders, I'm going to give you your founders question. For the founders, right, the people would deliberate in whatever limited way they would, because they would be called upon, right, to be the citizen soldiers who would. But that's not really the case for nuclear war. So I just wonder if there's something more you can talk about with that, because there's something so interesting about the role of deliberation and war, and nuclear war in particular, and that decade, I think.
I firmly believe that people deliberate over war. The American people do deliberate over war. I do firmly believe in the Jacksonian impulse, and I don't mean that in this kind of, oh, I hate the American people kind of way. Realize, as I said, it is a rational policy choice. Americans have generally succeeded in their objectives at relatively low cost compared to other nations when they have engaged in military action. And we're very good at engaging in military action. So speaking, weirdly, efficiently to say that, but that's been true. But I would point to instances where we have very clearly debated war with reason, with passion, sometimes ad hominem, sometimes not. The best example of that is an era I've studied and Mary Stuckey has also spent a lot of time with, and that's the debate over Lend-Lease and to enter World War II, beginning roughly with FDR's 1936 State of the Union address and extending all the way to the Japanese declaration of war. This was an extraordinary persuasive campaign by a president. The American people, by a 90 to 10% margin, wanted no interference with any war, including if the Germans invaded Mexico in 1935. By the time you get through, especially the two paired speeches, the Arsenal of Democracy and the Four Freedoms speech that occur within a week of each other in December of 1940 and January of 1941, FDR has brought the majority of Americans around to the notion we must aid Great Britain with all efforts short of war, which was just an extraordinary persuasive achievement that has not received the due recognition it does in our field. And this was a big, long debate. Mary's got great stuff on Charles Lindbergh and his arguments, and America First, opposing organizations, William Allen White, the great Emporia, Kansas press editor. That is an indication that the American people will and have beautifully deliberated over war. And I'd also point out to the congressional debate over the 1991 Gulf War. That was the one, to respond to Charlie for a minute, that was the one moment in recent American history where approval ratings of Congress actually went over 50%, because Americans were so impressed by the quality of that debate. So I think it's perfectly possible.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Murphy. Questions you didn't want a microphone for. And here in just a moment, we're going to transition the room very quickly, and then we have a reception. So please, as he puts on his
Sorry, size, right?